park. Oh, good. There's the park. We're on the right track.
Come on, Chuck.
Dismissed the sign. Yeah. We went up there. We went up there. We just went all over.
Carolyn,
Everybody needs
bring everybody up here. I don't want to start talking here now.
Yes, dear.
I don't want to. All right.
Yeah, I'll try, Margaret.
Like a teacher.
Okay. First of all, you notice here that where the railway used to be, now just a trail right there. And this at one time was a very bustling center for Breadalbane. Over there, that's where the railway station was located, right over there, on the right-hand side of the track. There was actually two rail lines here. One was passing lane, one was passing track, and the other main track. And then there were warehouses, potato warehouses, and freight sheds, and all that kind of stuff. It's all gone now. This park here, part of that land for the Murrays from Kirk and Hartley, part of that land was donated by your father to form that park. There's just a little part of land that he actually owned there.
Triangles.
Yes, yeah. So now at one point here, that's the old hall over there, which is kind of in bad shape right now, but they're doing some work on it. Used to have a movie theater there. Once a week, you'd have a movie. And on Saturday night, we'd come and show a movie. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Those are like pews in there and so on. They had a stage at the front. And the man who showed them was actually a relative of my dad's. His name is Bouchot. Right. And this first location here of a little cottage Charles Murray built right on that site. When they first came here to build the dam site, they built a little building right there. That's where it was, right over there. Later sold that property to Seaman, who ran a store there all during the time when we were children. There was a store there, and that was a warehouse, egg grading station. My grandfather, Charles, purchased this property in the early 1800s, early 1880s, as a site for a mill. And it was one of the better sites on the island, actually. There's a small stream, as you can see, comes in from here this side, and then there's a larger stream back here. When the water was fully up, it backed the water up about 3/4 of a mile. All that area that's in grass now was underwater. But over the years, what's happened is it's filled up with sediment and mud. So when we were young, we used to be able to row a boat all the way up to what we call the forks. There's two streams come together. And I can remember skating in wintertime all the way up, about 3/4 of a mile up and back. It was wonderful. Yeah. So we'll go over and we'll talk some more over here. Okay? In a situation like this, nobody's around and places get vandalized.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Oh dear.
Well, it's bound to happen, wasn't it? Thank you. This building was, at one time, the little electric light plant that supplied power to the village. My dad had 26 customers, I think it was. And he had built power lines all up to the village, and actually extended them up over the hill there to some of the farmers up on top of the hill there. It originally started, the first electricity in the village here was in 1917, and I told the story there last night about that, how that when Grandfather was running the sawmill, which is over here, the brothers Wesley and Richard, who had moved up to the States, they got a hold of a small DC generator and sent it down, and they hooked it up in the mill to supply light for the mill, because in the spring of the year when there was all kinds of water, that's when they did a lot of their sawing, and so they were able to put on a second shift and saw to heart's content. So of course once the lights were in the mill, it would be awful nice to have those in your home, so they ran a line across to the house. And this was quite a novelty in 1917, because the only place on the island at that time that had electricity, electric lights, was Charlottetown. So this little village in the middle of nowhere was quite
Up with the times.
yeah, up with the times. And so Kennedy store was at it, and had ended up with 5 customers on this little DC system, which operated that way until about 1936 or 37. To build this building and install an alternating current 2300 volt generator, and of course then you could transform the power down to whatever location you were at. And he operated that system until 1950. In 1950 was a time of rural electrification all over the island, and of course but everywhere at that time, I guess. Brunswick and everywhere was doing the same thing. And so the utility in Charlottetown, which is Maritime Electric, built lines, and they eventually approached here. And my dad wasn't supplying 24-hour service, which was the thing. He either had to supply 24-hour service or he had to surrender his business. And unfortunately, it wouldn't be profitable for him to do that because he didn't have enough water certain times of the year to do that. Now, certain times of the year that you could do that. But he had a schedule, interesting schedule. The schedule was in the morning, he would start the plant up in the morning, about 6 o'clock, and run for 2 hours. That allowed the farmers to pump the water for their cattle and do all the things they needed to do. And then we'd shut the plant down and he would run it for an hour at noon. You could listen to the news and you could do whatever you needed to do, and you could pump the water again, whatever. Then he shut down until just before dark, and he ran until midnight. And on special occasions he would run until 1 o'clock. Now this required him to be involved a lot because he had to come over to start and stop. He was working at the railway at the time. He was the station agent. So it occupied a fair bit of his time. And of course he didn't make any money at this. He kept very meticulous records of all this, and over the years he eventually got his investment back, but he had nothing for his time. Nothing. It was like a public service he was supplying.
$1 a month was the
$1 a month was the minimum bill, yes.
Oh, wow, goodness.
Then, where was I going with that? That's the problem getting old, isn't it? Yes.
Electrification of the
After
Yes.
he gave up the franchise.
Yes, when they purchased the lines from him and gave him very small amounts of money for it, he was not happy with that. But they would only give him $500 for this equipment here and everything he had in there, which was worth a lot more than that to him. He said never. So he operated that for himself from 1950 until just before his death in 1968, and supplied electricity to our home. Now, interesting thing happened in 1956. We had a major ice storm in Prince Rupert in 1956. It was equally as bad as the one that everybody knows about in Ontario and Quebec, and in your area too, I think.
Yes,
just a few years ago. What, that's about 4 years ago or so?
4 years ago.
Everything came down. We had some pictures around somewhere of that. All the power lines came down. It was just a total disaster. And so everything was in darkness in the village.
Except your
And
house.
it was fully lighted. All the lights were on.
Turned any off.
And my dad was really feeling good about it.
Look at you guys.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, the lights were not restored in this village until 5 weeks after.
Oh my God.
Yeah. 5 weeks after. That was 1956. And when I was working up north I was working up north in 1960. My dad was getting older then, and it was quite a chore for him to come back and forth here to start the plant and put it on, especially in wintertime. I'll back up a little bit. Before that, my mother got quite frustrated with this electrical system. As you can imagine, she wanted to have a refrigerator and a few things like that, which of course she couldn't have as long as this plant wasn't operating 24 hours a day. And of course my dad, there was no way he was going to hook up with the Maritime Electric.
Not gonna get it. No.
So she got at me said, why don't you try to persuade your dad to hook up this maritime electrical? I thought about it for quite a while, and I finally came up with a scheme I thought might work, and it did. And the scheme was that we would install a two-way switch arrangement so that he could operate the plant when he wanted to, and switch over to maritime electric when he wasn't operating the plant. And he agreed to that, and we installed that. So that's the way he operated it from then on. And of course, any time there was major loads on, he made sure he had the plant running. so that the bill was minimum, you see. And but then when I was working up north, I think it was a company to help out, and I decided to build start from the house and operate it without going out. Winter days you could do that. So that was a source of great delight to him. He bragged about how wonderful smart his son was. And anyway, it operated just until just before his death in 1958. And of course, things have gone down badly since then, as you can see. Now, if you want to take a look in this window here, you can see some of the old equipment. I don't want anybody going in because it's not safe for it. But you can see, for those that are in it, you can see the old switchboard there. Yep. And,
You didn't tell that the
generator.
But my dad was pointing to that.
Oh, was
And see, he didn't like getting up at night when he would run it until 2 o'clock actually if somebody's having a party. And he didn't like getting up at night, so he came up with a rat trap and an alarm clock. So I don't know how it was rigged. So when the alarm clock went off at 2 o'clock, it hit the rat trap and it shut off the power.
Whatever more he can come up with is something else.
Was he good friends with Rube Goldberg?
Sure sounds like it.
Very inventive.
Or our dad was like that.
Yeah, Dad would have done that.
Yeah.
All right, there was another thing I wanted to
figured out how to get
explain.
up.
Before I had built this controls that he could operate and shut it off,
Going to tell it now.
Yeah,
my father had an invention to actually shut the thing down without him being there at night. And it was quite an ingenious little contraption. He used an alarm clock and a rat trap. And what he had, the arrangement was, he took the thing that you wind the alarm clock off, and he put a spool on that. And he had a thread or a string that would wind up when the alarm clock went off. Would wind up, would trip the rat trap, which in turn tripped the lever which held the wheel that turned the water on. And there was a weight on that, and that would turn the water off of the let the mill down.
It was way up and stuff.
Yeah.
I know little kids, there's a game, Mousetrap, and yeah, exactly that kind of thing. Yeah.
All right, we'll go over here and show you explain some more. So,
Oh, okay.
and the mill, the sawmill was right over here. It was built right into the bank here. Now I've got a picture of this mill, so it gives you some idea. Looking from, I think you saw this last night. It gives you a little bit all this too. So we'll drop it again. Yeah. Now this picture would have been taken from the bridge over there, looking this way. Sure. So the mill was built right into the bank.
Oh,
and the front of the mill would be right here. We're hardly standing there.
Oh, okay.
And there was a sluiceway here, a ramp to haul the logs in. Ooh. And the logs would come into the saw, would be sawed, and then this is where the slabs went out the back of the mill. You see, this is where the slab bottom was. Now, there's trees growing there now, but on this picture you can see that area was clear, okay, up there, and the logs were piled up there on that bank, and then they would just roll down into the water, and then they came in here, and then they had a chain arrangement. They'd lash through the log and haul it right into the mill, and that's where it'd be sawed. Now, Uncle Wellington, your grandfather, of course, he when he built his boat, they have had a woodlot, which is about 2.5 miles from here, 90-acre woodlot. They went there and cut all the wood for it, and had it piled up there, brought it in the mill, sawed it, and he built the boat from that. So
That's great.
now this mill operated until the late 1940s, but it was slow. The maximum they could saw would be about 4,000 feet a day, which is not a lot of lumber, 4,040 feet. And so it became unprofitable going because wages got so high that you just couldn't make a profit. So my dad stopped doing it. And but the mill stayed there, and actually we saw some just for ourselves. And I helped my dad saw some lumber there from time to time. When any repairs had to be done, we just go get a log.
There you go, handy.
Did they grind flour at the mill?
No, they didn't.
I'm gonna walk in front of you, so don't snap.
Hey.
From Ireland. And the whole family came, including his mother, his Smallman. John married Anne Smallman. Another brother, Thomas, married Mary Smallman. And then there was a Thomas Murray who married a Mary Smallman.
All from the same lineage.
All from the same lady. Yeah.
That's weird.
Yeah. It is.
So maybe I was focusing on
and his wife, and then their son, Emerson, and his wife, Hilda. Infant son. No, he actually lived about 4 years older or something like that. Yeah, 4.5.
4 years and 6 months.
Yeah. Let me explain who we got here. Charles had a brother, James. Okay. Now I'm not sure where James was buried, but James Henry was called. James had a son called Henry as well. This is his burial spot. His wife. There are three sons actually of James buried here. Henry, William, and Hannibal. They were all three sons of James.
Because if it hadn't, we wouldn't be here. So, and from what I understand, I've seen a little picture of the boat, and it was named after what my grandpa said was a popular breakfast cereal at the time. I think AXO was the name of it. But, so it got as far as being christened with a name, but not too far out into the sea. And that was
After all that other words,
But he and my dad went on to build their house and many other things, and conventions, so that's the last time I know we've built any boats.
Good story.
You have a story, Hartley? No?
I'm at a loss for one, other than he's just always in mischief. And as I recall, he was in college in West Virginia. He escorted a cow to the top of the bell tower.
Yes.
All the way to the top of the bell tower.
Yeah.
So, it was mooing there when everyone got up in the morning.
Yeah, he was a kind of a jokester, I think.
I'll tell one on him when you're finished.
You will? Okay.
Yeah, it's just a little short one. You finish it.
Oh, well, I just had a short tale, went out too much energy. So Grandpa made what he called a canobrion, and I think that's just a word he made up. But it was a wheel with two sticks, like a garden plow, but without the plow. And he just gave that to me and said, "Yeah, just go run around." Thinking that was just great fun, but I'm sure it was just a way to keep me out of trouble. Yeah, that's what it is. Right? I've never heard that word before. And I think Ian just invented it on the spot. The dry sense of humor.
The one that struck me so funny with him was, he told me this when I took my father and mother down to visit him. That's in the 60s, I guess it was. He said that they were retired then, living outside of Warren, and at one point they had 4 people on a party line, and he said the line was always busy, and these, he said there were 4 family had moved in, and they were always on the phone. You could never get the phone. But this particular day, he wanted the phone, and it was some American people talking on the phone, and he picked it up 3 or 4 times. They were still talking. So he thought, And so he quoted the first 2 picked up the phone, they were still on, and he quoted the first 2 verses of Genesis in Hebrew. And they said, "Oh, those damn foreigners, they want the line." And he got the line.
Anybody else have a story to offer to this? This is a little incident that happened in the old Murray home. I think you've all seen the picture of that by now. This was originally Murray home was in Fredrickton. This is the picture here. This home was filled with all kinds of nooks and crannies, and particularly in the upstairs. And there was one place where you could go. I remember doing this myself. You could go to the bedroom and get into the attic. There's a little narrow passageway. It would be less than maybe a third the width of a doorway. But right alongside of it, there was an opening for a small window. It would be about 2 foot square. And the story is that Richard, Ruth's grandfather, he had a cousin visiting with him, and so he wanted to play a trick on him. So they got upstairs in the dark, and he's leading him on this. He's supposed to be taking him to his bedroom. And but in those days there's no electricity, of course, so he either had a lamp or he fumbled around in the dark. So they're fumbling around in the dark, and he wants to play a trick on his visiting cousin. So he gets him, come this way, and he reaches his hand out once in a while. So the person's feeling their way along, and he slips through this little narrow passageway, and then sticks his hand through this 2x2 window opening, and then he said, "Come right this way." And so he comes right up against the wall, and he's trying to feel around where this hole is, and he says, "How the H did you get through that?" So I can remember Uncle Richard telling that story and laughing years afterwards. The other story that comes to mind was Richard and Wesley, when they went up to Boston area to work. They went into a restaurant one day, and they were chatting among themselves. And and they weren't paying much attention to what was happening around them. The waitress came along, and she was in a hurry, and she was in a cranky mood. And Wesley was doing the talking at the time. Richard was listening. And she said in a very sharp tone, "What do you want?" And without a moment's hesitation, Richard said to Wesley in a loud voice, "She wants to know what you want." And Wesley, without a moment's hesitation, said, "Hey?" And she wants to know what you want. And Richard said to her, "You have to speak a little louder, he's deaf, you know." And then they made her talk in a loud voice all the way so while they ordered their meal. And of course, they could do this with an absolutely straight face, both of them, and just made a total fool of the girl. And then, of course, laughed about it for the rest of their lives, of course. So they were full of tricks like that. Yeah.
It reminds me of a story about my grandfather, and he did that kind of humor too, where he would have a perfectly straight face
Yes.
and invent this whole story. When I was a real little kid also, I liked this particular kind of corn, and we were going to the grocery store and it wasn't on the shelves, so he asked, he found a stock boy, a poor innocent stock boy, and said, "What's the matter? What kind of store is this? You don't have Kurt's corn. Where is this?" And he went into this whole thing with the stock boy. I think I really need to speak to the manager. You don't even have Kurt's corn. And to me as a little kid, that was so fun that my grandpa would invent a joke that I could sort of be part of, and that an adult would be who we were playing the joke on. So, sort of that same kind
Same
of
type of humor, yeah.
I played a trick on one of his friends and made out it was a weekday and got him to go to work, and it was on a Sunday. I don't know. Do you remember how that one went? I guess it's part of the...
No, but I do remember a story that just came to my mind. It was, I think it was Richard again. Richard was pretty good at this stuff. He was working in an office somewhere in Boston. And the boss was a guy that he was very aloof and quite arrogant in his attitude, and none of the people really liked him that well. And so they called him the swellhead. They called him. So this got them. They got thinking about this, and they said, "You know what we need to do? We need to get him a hat." When he came in the morning, the first thing he did, he took off his coat, put it on the coat rack, and hung his hat up. And he went into his office. He wouldn't speak to anybody. He was very grouchy. And so they said, "We should play a trick on him. What we need to do is we'll get a hat exactly the same as the one he's got." In those days, hats were made, and they had hat shops all over the city. We get one made exactly the same as his, only a half a size smaller. And so they got all the people in the office, and they all collected enough money from them. And they went out to this hat shop, and they got this hat made exactly the same as the hat he had. And when he came in this particular morning, they switched hats on him in his hat. Well, he came out at noon and he put his hat on, sitting on top of his head. He pulled him, just trying to and he finally gets it sitting on top of his head, and he goes out to lunch with his hat. And he comes back in, and then they switched it back. And they kept doing this to him every so often. They do this to him. And finally he caught on something was going on. And one day he came in the morning, he took his hat into the office with him. Funny up, but they had great fun for a long time with that.
Did you ever get the message?
I don't know. But it used to be great fun for me when I was just in my early teens, when the four of them would get together, while before they were still living at the time, which was Wellington and Richard and Leslie and my dad. And they'd swap these stories. It was just pure entertainment. You'd just be laughing the whole time. And they'd be telling ghost stories and all kinds of...
Well, there's, ghost stories. There's a story where there were some girls that lived a farm or two across from where they lived down here. And of course, a house full of boys, and that's a real magnet, so you wanted to go there. So we used to come through the fields and spend all evening. And they'd say they were afraid of something after dark. And so after we take them home, these girls home a few times and decided there was enough of them they could fix them. So 2 or 3 of them went and hid in the grove and put sheets on and chains. And when they went to go home, they came upstairs and they never came back.
Then there's the story of that I think it was Wesley and Richard again. Went to a church gathering with young people, and they were invited to this home where there was 2 young ladies for dinner. Well, what happened was they put the young people, the older people were in one room, and they put the young people by themselves in the other room. So there was just the 4 of them. There was these Richard and Wesley and these 2 girls. And so they sat down to eat, and of course they thought, one of the girls said to me, well, you should say the blessing over the food. Well, neither one of them was used to saying the blessing. And so Wesley said to Richard, well, say Uncle Hannibal's, he has the blessing, and he always said the same blessing. And so you say Uncle Hannibal. So Richard started to say this blessing, and he said, our Heavenly Father, for the food which we are about to receive. Then he got stuck. He couldn't remember what came after it. And there's this long silence. And Wesley pipes up, for Christ's sake, amen. And that's just the whole middle part of it. Well, of course, when they reflected on what they had said and how they said it, of course, they got to laughing then and made absolute fools of themselves. And Uncle Wesley said, needless to say, we never got invited back again. Yeah. There's I talked earlier about how John and Ann had come from Ireland, and they had 11 children, 7 boys and 4 girls, and they eventually settled in Fredrickton here, or Pleasant Valley as it was called at that time, just up the road here, sort of ways on the 100-acre farm. Charles and married Elizabeth Sullick, and they moved to Breadalbane in the 1890s when he started the sawmill operation there. The old house in Fredrickton here, which burned to the ground and on Thanksgiving Day in 1964, was filled with all kinds of old antiques and relics. And it was a wonderful place for us to visit as children. I remember there was all kinds of hiding places and all kinds of interesting things to see and do, and we had some wonderful times there. My brother and I, with Uncle Nelson and Aunt Mary and Emerson and Hilda, who lived there at that time. And the loss of the house was just like almost like the loss of a member of the family, because there was so much history that went up in smoke there. So we really mourned the loss of that home. Now, Charles was very much interested, as a young man, very much interested in the milling operation. Even though he had a Breadalbane, which was much more reliable and much better site, and they built the dam and they built the mill there and began to saw wood, saw lumber. They also had a grist mill, which they ground feed for cattle. Now, during the time when the mill was operating in full force, one of the things that they were doing they were manufacturing tobacco boxes. These were wooden boxes about 6 inches square and about a foot high. These were made from hardwood, and they were shipped by railway cars all the way to St. John, New Brunswick, to a company there that was making chewing tobacco, and they packed this chewing tobacco in these tobacco boxes. During that time, when they were into that business, that they started the electric light plant, because that was the very busiest time at the mill. The old house in Fredrickton was built by John and Anne, and the house in Breadalbane was built by Charles and Elizabeth. When they moved up from Fredrickton, they turned the property over in Fredrickton to Nelson, who was the oldest son of the home at the time. And Uncle Nelson, he wasn't what I call a great farmer. He farmed, but that wasn't his real heart. He taught school here in Pleasant Valley, the school out down the hill here, and he also was a justice of the peace and a notary public. So he did quite a bit of legal work, and on his passing, Emerson also became a justice of the peace. Elaine's father, Major, when he moved out of the family home, they had a property up about a mile above Breadalbane, and I think he mostly farmed as well. And they lived there, I guess, I don't know how many years. Do you know, Elaine, how long they were there? Is that
That'd be her grandfather.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. But, no, yes, it'd be her grandfather, that's right. And I was delighted last night when Elaine was able to identify in the picture, Major in the picture, one of the little pictures I had. So there was a story about the mill that I wanted to tell. I told pretty hardly this afternoon. My grandfather Charles, his brother-in-law was John Holmes. John Holmes was married to Alicia Murray. And John was a businessman, and my grandfather signed a note as a co-signer for his brother-in-law to raise some money for a business venture. And it turned out rather badly. The business deal collapsed, and John left the country and left my grandfather Charles with this large debt that he had to repay. And it was actually crippling their whole operation. They were paying a very large interest on this debt, and it meant that in the wintertime, they all, my grandfather and Wesley and Richard, they all went up to the States to work and to raise enough money to pay the interest on this loan. And after about 2 or 3 years of this, Grandmother Murray, who was a deeply religious woman, was praying every day about this problem that they had, because they thought they were going to lose the mill property, which was grandfather's love and joy. And they were distressed by this whole thing. It was keeping them in poverty, because they were paying a very large interest on this loan. I think they were paying somewhere between 12 and 14%, which was a ridiculously high interest rate. So she was praying every day about this, and she had a vision. And in this vision, she saw a man on a white horse, and she sensed that it was in Charlottetown. And in her vision, she went up to this man on the white horse and said, "Do you know where I can borrow some money?" And that's all she had in the dream. Excuse me. And so he believed this was a divine revelation. And Nelson, who was the oldest son home at the time, she insisted that he take her to Charlottetown immediately. So they went in the next day. And they drove down. She didn't know what she was going to do. She just was there because she thought she should be there. And they go down the main street in Charlottetown, and she saw a man on a white horse. She immediately got out and approached him, and she raised the question that she had raised in her dream. And he looked rather startled at her, but he said, "Well, I don't know, lady, but there's a law firm up there, and the man's name is Mr. Large. I think perhaps they might be able to help you." She immediately went up, parked herself down in his office, and asked to see him. And after a while, he came out and asked if he could help her. She went in and she told him the predicament that they were in with this huge loan that they had. They couldn't even pay the interest. And she said, "I wonder if there's anything that you could do to take this loan over and give us a better interest rate." And he said, "Well, Mrs. Murray, we'll have a look at this and we'll let you know." So they sent some people out and made an assessment of the property, what it was worth, and so on. And then they told her, yes, they would take this mortgage at 6% instead of 12%. Well, she immediately wrote grandfather, who was up in Portland, Maine, with Richard and Wesley, working in mills up there, and told them what had happened. Well, grandfather Charles was so upset when he got this letter that he sent, well, it was Richard or Wesley, I think it was Wesley he sent home. And he said, you have to go home immediately because I think your mother is losing her mind. He couldn't believe that, he had tried so hard himself to get a better interest rate for this mortgage and so on, and it failed. And he couldn't believe that she actually had done this. And of course, in those days, it was most unusual for women to be involved in this kind of activity anyway. Excuse me. So, he sent, I believe it was Wesley home, and Wesley got the word, yes, she's got it. And they all came home. They were all able to come home then and work in the mill, which is where their heart was. And they worked at paying this debt off, and actually the last of the debt was paid off after my grandfather died, but my father was paid the last of it off. But it was a burden on them all their lives. But it was quite remarkable that she had this vision. And then there's another story which I could tell you about how my father got his name. It's kind of similar in a way. Again, she was in her early 40s, and she was very sick. She was quite ill. Her doctor was a doctor by the name of Bradshaw, and which the family really respected and highly valued his services, but he couldn't seem to do anything to help her. And she was getting worse. They thought she was going to die, actually. But there was a doctor in Charlottetown who, there were some stories about this doctor who was making rather spectacular cures of people. And his modus operandi was a little strange, but grandmother insisted to grandfather that she see this doctor. And he didn't have any faith in this doctor at all. He thought he was a quack. But because his wife he thinks she's going to die, he's going to cater to whatever she wants. So they bundled her up in a sleigh. It was in the wintertime. I think it was in March. With a big blanket around her, and they laid down in the bottom of the sleigh to this doctor. Well, when she came to see the doctor, what happened was the doctor asked her about her condition, and grandfather went with her. And then the doctor took a hold of her hand, and when he took hold of her hand, he shut his eyes, and he started to groan and rub his side where she was having all this particular pain. And it appeared as if he was experiencing the same kind of symptoms that she had had. And he said, without opening his eyes, he said, will I prescribe? And nobody said anything. And his assistant said to my grandfather, say yes, say yes. So he said yes. And then he began to list out certain things medication that she should have, certain herbs and things like that. And his assistant wrote it all down. And then he sort of came out of this almost like trance-like state he was in. And he started to talk to him quite normally. And grandmother said to him, will I get better? And he said, yeah, you certainly will. And he said, not only that, but he said, you'll have a son and a daughter. And she was in her 40s then. And she laughed. And she said, well, if I have a son, I know what his name will be. And the doctor's name was Dr. Pomeroy. That's how my father got his name. And she did, in fact, have a son and a daughter. The daughter died in infancy. But my dad lived, and that's how he got his name, Dr. Pomeroy. Now, when my father was in his 20s, he actually wrote a letter to this Dr. Pomeroy. I don't know whether we ever found it or not. And Dr. Pomeroy replied, he asked him if he had remembered this incident. And he replied and said that yes, he had. And he was pleased to hear from him. And it was shortly after the death of that little girl that Victoria Hattie came into the family as the new daughter. So that's another one of the very interesting stories. Now, when I was younger, I had great trouble believing some of these stories. And perhaps some of you do too. But all I can say is this. In all my life's experience with all of these brothers, my dad included, they were the most integrous men that I ever met. I've never known them to tell them the truth. And so I now believe the story completely. And there's no reason not to, because of the people that told me the story.
I was the same. I used to think, especially about that Irish blessing, I used to think, oh, that's a nice story. But then when Emerson was working on that parochial house up west and came back and said, this priest said to him, well, are you one of the Fredrickton Murrays? And Emerson said yes. And he said, well, I know a story about your family. And it, connects the small one connection. And he told it back to him almost the way he'd always heard it. So he must have been related to that bishop. That's what we should have found that out. But he must. They knew the story too.
I was talking to somebody yesterday that reminded of Emerson, and I had very few memories of Pomeroy, but just a few little flashes because I was very young when he died. But apparently, we were talking really about the Smallmans and this connection between families, and Pomeroy and Emerson sort of followed that pattern.
Yes.
And the two brothers married sisters. That's right.
No.
No, not sisters.
Uncle and
like-
nephew married.
Yeah, that's right.
Two brothers married the other two sisters.
That's right. And I know that this was something they used to do. There was always a bit of rivalry between the two girls, Grace and Hilda.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember years afterwards I used to rely on this. We'd come home for Christmas or New Year's, and everyone would get their fill of turkey and sort of retire in the other room with the fire or whatever. And Emerson would sort of sit back and he'd wait for an opportune moment, and then he'd introduce one of several topics which had proven to be fruitful in the past for generating just the kind of entertainment he was looking for. These topics were usually touched on religion or the monarchy or social mores of the time. And you could tell that the girls had occasionally resolved that they weren't going to get drawn into this. And they'd start off just to have a very little discussion about this. But their natural disagreement and their natural rivalry start to manifest itself. And so each one would tend to make a particularly, they'd sort of raise the heat in this discussion a little bit more and a little bit more. And each time one of them, in a sense, lowered the tone of the debate even further by making a particularly inflammatory point, Emerson would have the habit of saying, "There now," as if that was a particularly good point. And as if the person who had made it had just scored quite strongly on their side in the argument. The inevitable result of this within about a half an hour is the two would be just like a cockfight, just going at each other. Oh, and Emerson would sit back and slap his leg and laugh at this entertainment which he created. And they, at this point, were completely oblivious to this because they're so engaged in the battle. And I just remember that happened year after year after year. And the twinkle in Emerson's eye as that started up was just, he'd be ruminating over his turkey, and you could just see him waiting for the choice moment when he was going to toss the bone out and let the two dogs fight.
Yeah, exactly. Back in 1876, wrote a letter to the authorities around the time we were building the railway on the island, and asking them to consider a station to be erected in Breadalbane. You can see from this that he was anticipating the fact that he was going to be building the mill, because the mill was built in the 1880s. And this is replied from the Minister of Public Works to him. And I'll just read it and then I'll pass it around to you. And it's dated April the 1st, 1876. Sir, I am directed by the Minister of Public Works to acknowledge receipt of the communication of yourself and others asking that a station be erected on Prince Edward Island Railroad at Breadalbane. I have the honor, sir, and he signs his name. He doesn't say whether they're going to do anything or not. Typical reply from a civil servant. But in fact, they did build the station and became sort of the center of the village. So we'll just pass that around and look at it. That's the original document.
It's early Sunday morning. This is in the town of Breadalbane, and I'm looking out right now towards the direction of the Murray home, and it's right back in there. And I'm standing at the street that leads up to the church. There's the main highway there, and there's the modern church. The larger church is having services going on right now. Central Trinity United Church. And I'll just slowly pan over the landscape of the town. This is the main part of what remains of the town of Breadalbane. Decades ago it used to be a lot more going on here than there is now. But this is the main part of what's the town now. And I'm going to move on up. That's the church down there. I'm going to go ahead and move on up a little bit closer. Okay, I've moved up a little bit closer toward the church and just want to give us an idea of what the houses in the town look like today. They don't look like they've changed a whole lot probably, except they could use a little bit of maintenance and repair. Some of them, and some of them are quite nice. A lot of houses you can tell are fairly old, but they've been kept up fairly well. And you can see through here, down in the city park, the Murray home is right across the main road there from this park. And you can see they've put in a tennis court. Tennis court's a tennis court. I'm not going to take the time to really walk to get a good view of it, but I guess that's about the most modern improvement that I can see here. I'm going to walk up the street a little bit more to get a little bit different vantage point. It's the church. And a little row of houses across the street here. There's a better view of the back part of the tennis court, and you can see how the town just blends right back into the countryside here. Farmland just right at the edge of town all around and on every side. Imagine I'm standing on the lawn. This probably is part of the church property, or it could belong to this house here. I'm not sure which. An older outbuilding there, and I see they've got lumber piled up here, so apparently that's a little sideline for whoever lives in this house here. And just panning around the street here and going around back to the church. This dog was sitting on the porch for about a half an hour that we've been here, and all of a sudden it just jumped up and scurried under the porch. I don't know if I did something to startle him or what. And this is what you see as you look from the back of the church. And I'm just going to take the camera around 360 degrees. Grain field behind the church. There's countryside off in the distance. I'm standing in the driveway of the church, of the house that's right across the street from the church. Just looking around. There's the house across the street from the church, looking down toward the main road, and back around to the church. And finally, here's the entrance to the church.
Might as well stay. It's already 10 o'clock.
Okay.
Should be coming any time, I suppose.
Okay.
Don't you think?
I guess.
You just have to go down there, you have to turn around and come back.
Okay. Yeah, we're waiting. We got here kind of early, so we're waiting on the rest of the group. We're going to have a church service here this morning. He's all bark and no bite. Actually, he didn't start barking until just a couple minutes ago. This is the inside of the church. From the back, looking forward. Front, looking back.
Until there was a man by the name of Donald Crawford, whom Wellington mentioned. And he was like an itinerant preacher. He went from village to village and spoke about the Lord. And his message was centered on the fact that all true believers should be one, and that the church should be called the Church of Christ, or the Christian church, rather than have a whole lot of different names. And he felt that that would bring people together in unity. And this message caught on to the Murray family. And also the slogan, in which they really appreciated, was, it said, "Where the Bible speaks, we will speak, and where the Bible is silent, we will be silent." And it was felt that if every church lived according to that principle, there wouldn't be all the divisions there are in Christianity. So that some people would have a view on certain aspects of Christianity, and if the Bible didn't particularly speak on that, then you wouldn't make it a point of controversy. So the principle was extremely good foundation in which to establish a church. And I will read a little bit from this, but you can pick it up afterwards and you have one for yourselves. We Murrays in our family, we seem to have this morning frog. Donald Crawford believed the desire to preach the gospel was kindled by the Spirit of God. He began to preach at the age of 21. And there were other men, quite a few other men, one was Campbell in the United States. I can't remember all my church history, but I know there was a man by the name of Campbell, and you probably remember more than I do. You should know this. Anyway, at 21 he began to preach. He received no academic training, but was one of the class of men who, because of natural gifts and industry, became educated. In other words, he was self-educated. The first baptism in Breadalbane was Mrs. Samuel Can.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've learned some things this morning. So, this idea that people can be in unity in their faith is an interesting one, and I'm always appreciative of that. But it's caused me to realize, as my father, it's always puzzled me for a long time. I can't really recall that my father has ever particularly sworn. I'm sure that may have occurred, but I can't ever remember it happening in my presence. And I remember one day in particular the car breaking down on the trip to Prince Edward Island, and a particularly frustrating series of events and a lot of stress. And my father working at the front of the car, and I'm hearing a very unique sound, which is my father signing off denominations as if they were swear words. Presbyterian, Bush Baptist. And I can see now where this comes from. This idea that perhaps these denominations aren't such a good thing. I'm telling stories of my dad, which I love to do. I occasioned this to my mother, say to my mother sometime, I never heard my dad swear, and she said, I was half asleep in bed one night, and your father came in very, very late, and the bed pretty much filled the room, and he thought I was asleep. I was just lying there, and as he came around the back part of the bed, he stubbed his toe on the bed so hard the whole bed shook, and there was this sharp intake of breath at the end of the bed, followed by my father saying, "Suffering, succotash." And my mother said, I realized then that if he wasn't prepared to swear in the privacy of his own home, under great duress and pain, it probably wasn't going to happen. psalm we're going to read this morning, and Dad said I should read one, and I said well, we should read another one, and anyways, he agreed we should read mine, and then I read them all, and I agreed I should read his. This is from Psalm 78. I apologize if I read this strangely. I've often been called on to read scripture in church, and I've only recently started to try to read things out loud the way they sound in my head, as opposed to the way they're written down on the page. So it might sound a little strange, but anyway, hope you bear with me and can get something up. Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words that come out of my mouth. I'm going to open my mouth in a parable. I'm going to say...
My mother loved this island. She was here as a child so many times. I don't know how many times, but she was here a lot. Her relationship with all her relatives was extremely special to her. She brought us back a couple of times, but she wasn't able to bring us back as much as she wanted. And as children, you don't listen too carefully to the stories that your parents tell you. I know she and Aunt Madge, Margaret Cheney, were very close, and they used to do a lot of things. My mother wrote a lot. She wrote an article, The Memories of the Island, which we've used quite a bit here, actually. And I've been asked to read about her grandmother. Grandmother loved her church. She always spoke of it as the house of the Lord. I wish more people went into church today the way Grandma did. Erect and stately in carriage, she sailed past the back pews as if they weren't there. She was an attractive figure in her flowing black dress and lace shawl with a bonnet of distinction set on her wavy hair. Brushing lightly past the pews in the center section, she only paused when she came to the front of the church in the family pew. Here she sat throughout the service, quiet and reverent. When it came time to sing the hymns, Grandma's voice, sounding sweet and clear, joined with those about her. Standing beside her, I used to like to peek up at her when she was singing. Her face shone so, and she looked so happy. My mother went on, I don't know, there was this influence of what it was in her life. She married a minister. My father died when my brother was about to go to college. She had a couple of years, she served as an intern in the church my father was in. And then both she and my younger brother went to college the same year. She went to Anglican Newton, and my brother went to Plymouth State College. They both graduated in the same year. And my mother became the first pastor of the Havenwood community in Concord. It's a retirement community. And she worked as their minister, their first minister and counselor there. And so it started right here.
I'm going to ask Mrs. DeGreta now to come
And Dad tells the story of when he was a young boy, probably my son Logan's age, some hot summer day, with the windows open in church, a June bug flew in and was just buzzing around the sanctuary. And Dad was watching it, and Grandfather was preaching a sermon, and the bug happened in front of my dad, and he snatched up and grabbed it. I don't know if he let out a whoop or whether he squished it or what, but right then and there, Grandpa scolded him right from the pulpit. So when Kurt and I were kids, we got threatened many times in church. You behave or I'll scold you from the pulpit. So, Logan. Behave. So, John 17. These words spake Jesus and lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, Father, the hour is come, glorify thy Son, that thy Son also may glorify thee, as thou hast given him power over all flesh,